Welcome to the People Teaching People podcast. Joining me on the podcast today is Tim Truax. I first connected with Tim when I reached out to him via email with the subject line, curious about PodSummit. Fast forward 2.5 weeks later, and I got to meet Tim at the Grand, which is the oldest theater in Calgary's downtown core. It is 112 years old, and it's also the location of the upcoming PodSummit. Tim is a career geologist and has been working in the oil and gas industry for over 15 years. He is a family man with a wonderfully supportive wife and 2 beautiful kids. As part of a journey to get more out of his passion for podcasting, Tim recently became the CEO at PodSummit, a new Canadian company that is focused on delivering unparalleled podcast events in Canada. PodSummit will launch their first event on September 20th to 21st, 2024 with PodSummit YYC, hosted in Calgary, Alberta. This event will bring together the entire Canadian podcast community and industry to celebrate the art of storytelling and to create a collaborative focal point where podcast communities and industry can come together to exchange ideas, interact, and learn from one another. Thank you so much for joining me today, Tim.
A pleasure to be here. I'm actually really excited. Nice Friday morning podcast record.
Absolutely. A Friday morning, it's good. It's good to sit down and have a conversation and talk about really interesting things with a really interesting person. So we connected over our shared interest in podcasting. But as I've been getting to know you a little bit better, this is really just one part of what you do and one of the many hats that you wear and all the things that you juggle. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and your story, and maybe starting with what led you to become a geologist,
Yeah.
which is what you do by day, I guess. And what did that journey look like?
Yeah, it's like you said, I wear a lot of hats. I didn't really realize I did this until a couple of months ago, maybe a year ago. I was like, whoa, there's a lot going on here. But yeah, let's start with the geology piece of it. So career geologist, of course, living here in Alberta, that's a big piece of the industry here and of the economy here. And so I came out after going to university out in Ottawa for geology. I came out here about 15 years ago, got a job in oil and gas. And I've been doing kind of that ever since. And my passion really grew from, if I'm being completely honest with you, watching the film Jurassic Park. I wanted to be a paleontologist for the majority of my life. I have a little journal article that I wrote that my mom and I dug out last time I was at home. And it said, from 1994, it said, I want to be a fossil geologist. And Jurassic Park came out in 93. So it's all off the back end of that. I've always been fascinated with the past, with concepts like evolution, with dinosaurs, fossils, all of that. And what the geologist piece of it and working actually in the industry out here in Alberta, how all that came together was essentially looking at my life and saying, how can I secure myself financially? How can I do the thing that I absolutely love? And then how can I also facilitate a great life? And Calgary provided that. That's the nexus of all of these things coming together, where I could essentially check those boxes in my life and continue to this day to do something that I love. I love putting together the puzzle pieces of the past to try to provide something of great value to the world. And, energy is so important to the day to day. And I know maybe some people don't love the idea of oil and gas, but it's a part of the transition that we're all going through, and the geology aspect of it will transition as well, because it's the same concepts and principles that go from discovering oil and gas or finding oil and gas to the energy transition and to doing it sustainably and economically and really pushing on all that. So yeah, so long story short, geology was something that I loved from a kid. The dinosaurs amazed me, and this was like a really cool way to embrace that passion as a child and do something pretty cool.
I love that you put it in writing as a child.
Yeah, it's
and
wild,
that your mom showed it to you, and that
Yeah.
is the path that you've taken. Do you have a favorite dinosaur?
Oh, Tyrannosaurus Rex, absolutely. It was my favorite as a kid. before Jurassic Park, and then Jurassic Park, it was the absolute star of that series. And it's always made me, I don't know, there's something about its size that has always fascinated me. And of course, it's like the king of the dinosaurs. It's the best.
I'm glad it's not alive anymore. I
Yeah,
will have to
that's
say. It'd be
well,
rather terrifying.
we've seen lots of movies. One that truly inspired me that shows, the T-Rex being alive today, probably not the greatest thing for humans.
No, not at all. And it's funny. Our kids have, they've been watching, especially with my husband, a lot of the old school movies. So I
Yes.
think that would sort of fall into that category for them. And they quite enjoyed them. And then this past summer, we went to Florida, Disney World, Universal Studios,
Awesome.
and we went on the Jurassic Park
Oh,
ride and
it's
got
so good.
stuck.
No, on the water one?
Yes, and had to be
Ah.
rescued.
Did you get to do the down, or did you have to go back on it?
You know what? We did not get to do the final big splash at the
Oh.
end. And we did try to go on it, and it didn't work out in our favor because they gave us passes or whatever to be able to circle back.
Next
And
time.
yeah, we're gonna have to go back again. But yeah, it was quite the adventure. We were enjoying it, loving it, and then we got stuck on the way up the hill for the final
Oh,
drop.
it's such a good. I haven't been there since I was like 14 or 15, and I remember walking through the gates that they have there and just melting as a 15-year-old. That was like, this is my everything, and I have this like vision of where I want to go, and going and actually experiencing the size and scale of that place was just phenomenal. I was like, okay, this is as close as we're ever going to get to the actual Jurassic Park.
Yeah, they do a really good job. They
Yes.
do such a good job. Now, from Geologist, one of the other hats that you're wearing is podcast host. And I found it so interesting to learn that you started your podcast, the Nerd Room podcast, in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And I checked, and maybe it's changed since when I checked, which was not that long ago, but you had 454 episodes.
Yeah, so we've got, I guess the official tally is 388, I guess, numbered episodes, and we have close to 75 or so bonus episodes that we've dropped into the feeds, just random episodes, movie reviews. Sometimes we throw things up as bonus episodes because they don't really fit the format of the weekly. But yeah, we've produced over 450 episodes to this point of the Nerd Room podcast, and still going strong, still dropping weekly, and really enjoying it.
That's just so wild. And when I realized, when you shared that you started podcasting in 2015, I was thinking back, and I don't think I'd even started listening to podcasts yet in 2015, let alone I hadn't thought about starting a podcast because it just wasn't something that was in my realm of what I was thinking about, what I was doing. So what led you to start podcasting at that time?
Well, I think a lot of it is framed up around what the Nerd Room podcast is all about, and that's pop culture. So you can probably guess from me loving Jurassic Park to becoming a geologist and having that path that I was also kind of always inside of fandom and nerddom and all of that. And I was a big Ninja Turtles and Ghostbusters fan as a kid, transitioned to Jurassic Park, and then found Star Wars and Marvel and all that. And as those franchises really started to become ingrained in the zeitgeist of modern culture, not just pop culture, but modern culture, I found myself falling more and more in love with all of that. And by the time we get to like 2008, 2010, I'm reading comic books, I'm really digging into the MCU. And as we get a little bit closer to that 15, the MCU, which is the big Marvel franchise, is really, really finding its footing. Star Wars is coming back into theaters for the first time in over a decade. And me and my friends, a couple of us, we're always kind of just chatting about this stuff. And I had a good buddy who started the podcast with me. He said, look, Kevin Smith podcast. And he said, everyone should be podcasting. And he said, do you want to podcast and talk about comics and all that kind of stuff? And I said, sure, why not? This seems like a cool hobby pastime. We had both just had children. And so we were looking for something that was kind of low barrier for entry, minimal time commitment to a degree, and something where we could actually get out of our houses after having these little ones and see each other for just a few minutes and talk about this stuff. And then eventually get out there and build a community around it, because we're always looking for people to share our passion with. Even back then, there wasn't as many people that were actively engaged in pop culture and wanting to talk about these, quote unquote nerdy things. And so we also want to build a community around that of both podcasters and listeners so that we could interact and kind of share with all of that. And so it was essentially a community building exercise, as well as a way for us to give our wives an excuse kind of to go and hang out and talk about these things. And that kind of grew from there. We added co-hosts. People have come and gone from the podcast, but we've made some really great friends. And I was thinking about it the other day, actually. I always looked at it as like a community building exercise for listeners, but I was reminded that I've made a absolute pile of podcasting friends through it. The guys that podcast about Star Wars and Marvel and all kinds of collecting things. And I've met so many cool people through it. And so it's been just this wonderful experience of getting to know myself, both behind a mic, my networking capabilities, my confidence. But ultimately, it came down to us just wanting to do something for ourselves. And it kind of turned and spiraled into this thing that it's been almost going for 10 years now.
That is so wild. You found your people.
Yes, I did.
And it is so important, especially for parents of young children. Mm-hmm. It's very all-consuming to be able to find those ways to really dig into who you are and the things that you love, because it's easy to lose sight of that and get really caught up into all things being a mom or a dad. It's a busy time. It's a very
incredibly busy.
Yeah, you have no idea, and then you get in it and you think, wow, I thought I was busy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like all of that stuff that you did before that you thought you were busy doing. And then it's like, insert these little monsters that are all consuming. And then I think it's important too, because, I'm a big tangential podcaster, so I'll find myself off on these little splays. But it's interesting because I think once my kids got to a certain age, I went through like a self-discovery thing where I was like, I have to kind of refine myself. I do define myself as a husband, as a father, and I have all these other monikers that go with it. But it's hard sometimes to remember who you were prior to children. And, and I'm not, this isn't a like, oh, hey, sympathy to parents. It's hard because you kind of turn off for a couple of years who you are in just survival mode. And podcasting has been something that's really helped me rediscover who I am beyond just being, and I love it, but just being a father and a husband. It's important to find those other pieces that you can say, I'm also this, that, and the other thing.
I love that you're saying that as a dad. It's nice to hear that. It's nice to hear that because I think it's so true. And as I shared with you a little bit, like that was kind of what started me in podcasting. It was, I think, essentially a search for my people.
Yeah.
And being able to engage in conversation with people, and sort of that too, like rediscovering who I was as this mom of 3 little kids and what I wanted to do, and really exploring and having some really meaningful, engaging conversations with people about things other than, like diapers and potty training.
It's a beautiful thing to not talk about that stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, it's such, you're right. There's the times when it's like survival mode and you sort of then come out of the fog. And I think our children have really challenged me, I think, to invest time and energy into remembering who I am, because they look, listen, watch, pay attention to what we're doing way more than we realize. And I do find little bits, especially because our kids are getting quite a bit older now. Our oldest is almost an adult, OMG, that they have been paying attention. And the fact that my husband and I have made time to be who we are definitely makes a difference.
Yeah, it helps them understand that. It helps them understand that it's okay to embrace the things that they like, and they don't have to, like, even for me, like I have a room in my basement that's full of like nostalgic collectibles and all that. And my kids go down there and they're like, okay, this is daddy's cool stuff. And I always tell them, this is me embracing who I am, the things that I love. I said, they don't have to be the same as the things that you love, but it's important for you to find the things that make you happy and really embrace them. Like my daughter loves reading, and she has really embraces that. She loves Lego, and my other little one is just loves Peppa. Like they're so into these things, and I just embrace that and have fun with it. And growing up as a kid that liked pop culture, Star Wars, and all that stuff, going back 20 years, that wasn't always like the cool thing. It wasn't always part of the day to day. but I loved that stuff. And I refused to let anyone tell me that I couldn't love something because it was a little bit different. And I think that's, like you said, they see that, they see the differences, and kind of exploring your own personal niche is so important, and embracing all of that that's, I think, a big essence of podcasting, is that it can become so niche and you're able to just embrace the things that you love. And I've always said, like, if you're podcasting about something you don't love, you gotta step back and rethink, because that's the thing that drives the passion. It's not money. It is the need and want to do something more and embrace one of the niches that is inside of you.
No, and it's funny. I expected when we hopped on today that I would see things in the background connected with the Nerd Room
Well,
podcast.
I usually record down there,
Okay.
but my current laptop is a bit old and is having a hard time putting the new Chrome on. And Riverside, I had this from a previous recording experience. It does not work super well on the laptop. So I want to make sure we're all stable here. I wanted to make sure that, we got two pro podcasters here. I didn't want to look like a rookie coming in, not having Riverside work or jumping on and off.
Well, I'm in awe of you, and I know that I'm going to be continuing to learn from you. And how we got connected was when I reached out to you and I said I was curious about this newer hat that you've added to your collection of hats, and that's your role as CEO of PodSummit. And we have PodSummit YYC coming to Calgary in September on the 20th and 21st at the Grand Theatre. I'm so excited about that. Without knowing anything, I literally put the dates in my calendar. I'm like, I'm going to block that time off and then get the details and find out more later. But I'd love to hear from you. Like, what is PodSummit and what is the story behind it?
Yeah, it's another one it's funny enough, it is somewhat connected to pop culture. But PodSummit in its essence it's essentially a Canadian podcast conference, for to put it in the simplest terms. And so every industry on planet Earth benefits from bringing like-minded people together inside of a single community or industry. And PodSummit is exactly that for Canadians. It's driven for Canadians because Canadians don't have this scaled, this Canada-wide sort of outlet or collaborative focal point where people can come together, talk about podcasting, learn, experience, network. And so what we're trying to build with PodSummit is essentially that, is a place where all of us podcasters can come together. Podcasting can even be a very isolating thing at times. You're talking to lots of people, but it's somewhat of a dispersed crowd and community. And the funny thing that we found about kind of starting PodSummit is it's actually a lot denser than you think. Once you start making the connection points, it's like, oh, there's a person down the road for me. Oh, there's, dozens, if not more, of podcasters in a, 10-kilometer range of me. And so it's really about breaking some of those barriers down for podcasters and bringing them together into a spot where they can find each other, find your people, exchange ideas, collaborate, become a much bigger Canadian community. And another goal is to bring together the east and west part of the podcasting communities too, because Toronto has a very active and robust podcasting community, but it's very difficult to connect it out here out west. And so a big piece of having it out here is that we're able to sort of drive a little bit of that Canadian collaboration across the divide that is the prairies and all that. And the story behind it, actually, going back to where it all connects up, is it was about a year or so ago, I had volunteered to run the podcast stage at the Calgary Comic and Entertainment Expo. As a lifelong podcaster and a lifelong fan of pop culture, there's a cool intersection there at the Calgary Expo that's run here every year. And they weren't planning on doing much. And I said, okay, I'll make a proposal and let's see if you guys are cool with it. And I kind of pitched this idea of the morning will be a bit more educational or connecting podcasters to a craft. And the back half of the day will be more live podcasts, so people can see the art of people putting together their podcast in a live setting, give the hosts an opportunity to have an active crowd in front of them. And that went really, really well. And I met a lot of great people doing that. And inside of that, I met the person that used to own PodSummit. His name is Ernest. And he ran PodSummit here in Calgary and Edmonton from 2017 to 19. Shut it down over the pandemic. And when I came into the podcast stage space for Calgary Expo, I had reached out to him and said, would you mind just connecting me with a few people that you have, a connection to that would be potentially willing for free to come jump up on the stage and talk about podcasting? And he sent me a few people like Meg and all that. And so we connected through that. But he also said on the back end, said, look, I used to do this PodSummit thing. You seem quite enthusiastic about this. I'm looking for someone to take it and buy it off of me and, strap a rocket to it and see what you can do. And so him and I chatted back and forth. And I, at that very point in time, I was sitting in this chair and I just spun around to my wife and I said, I think we should buy this. And she was like, right on, let's do it. And so we bought essentially the intangibles from him, the website, the domains, and all this kind of stuff, the concept, the logo. And then we spun it into a company last June. And then we went into a phase of the first thing we wanted to do was secure a venue. Venue and dates was our top priority. And we were able to secure the grant, as you mentioned. And our whole point behind that was we wanted something that didn't feel like a conference. I don't love the word conference associating with PodSummit, but it's the best way to explain it, where people get it until we actually do something. But the Grand was so important to us because it allowed us to create an environment that was unique to the conference space, where it was already a creative environment. It's a 110-year-old theater, and it's got beautiful brick walls and unbelievable lighting and seating and production value. And so we wanted people to come in and feel creative as soon as they walked across the threshold. And so once we were able to secure that, we kind of just ran. That took us a little while to get a hold of and get everything kind of figured out. But that was the main thing for us, is getting an area, an environment, an atmosphere that people could just feel different inside of, and kind of shake loose some of the hesitations around going in and networking with new people. This is about creating an environment where people have this very common goal of just doing better in podcasting, connecting with fellow podcasters, becoming a community member inside of that, and elevating and amplifying each other. And so, yeah, that's the story of PodSummit, where it came from. We're less than a year into the company. We've got this awesome slate of announcements coming up here in the not too distant future, maybe kind of in line when this really comes out. And we're just planning to make this as incredible, as engaging, and as valuable as possible for podcasters, for storytellers, really.
So I'm a podcaster. I decide I'm going to come to PodSummit. What can I maybe expect to experience when I get there?
Yeah. So as soon as you walk through the door, you're going to feel different. That's the point of the Grand. But really, when it comes from a programming standpoint, what we're trying to do from that, and we're actively just producing our first draft of the programming. And so we're being very particular about it. And the idea is to kind of kick off the day with inspiration. And so kind of as we walk through each part of the day, there's going to be different themes as we go about. So it's not going to be typical tracks. There's going to be a little bit of that. But the idea is the programming is going to be something that you kind of go on a journey on, a storytelling journey through. And so the front half of the day is going to be front loaded with keynote speakers. It's going to have more of the inspiration and trying to get people to drop that level of, maybe some anxiety, or trying to get people outside of the comfort zones, outside of the box that maybe they put themselves in, trying to inspire that. And then as we get into the back half of the day, we're going to be looking at some of the interesting elements that podcasters are asking about. So everything from AI to monetization to marketing, these type of things, but more from an experience side of things. And so it's less about the, direct education, and it's more about hearing of those experiences from people and then seeing what individuals can take away from. We're also inserting, as we did at the expo, all sorts of live podcasts so that people can witness different styles of podcasts live and how people actually go about it. Everything from the cadence and tone of voices to body language is so important in podcasting. And I think actually witnessing it is going to be very, very cool. And so we're trying to bring in some, really cool podcasters that have just a great platform to demonstrate to individual podcasters. We're also trying to connect the industry piece of it all to the podcaster as well. And so that's something that we're trying to integrate as well, is that there's a business side to podcasting as well. There's the creator side and there's the business side. And so what we're trying to do is facilitate a bit more of interaction there. So everything from microphone providers to platform providers to people that are in production, all of that. And so we're trying to create, like I said, that collaborative focal point where everyone in these communities and industry can come together. And then we're also going to be doing some cool networking events each evening so that we have the ability to kind of drop some of those barriers, relax a little bit, and have some fun in there. And that's really where some of that networking really happens. And one thing that we are doing that's going to be part of an announcement in the future here, but I can talk about it a little bit, is we're going to be actually doing a podcast pitch competition. And so podcasters, whether you have a brand new podcast or whether you're, like me and been in it for a long time, we're going to have the ability for you through a series of entry and kind of filtering, the ability for a group of people to get up on stage and actually pitch their podcast to professionals, get that feedback, and there may be some awards associated with that as well. So the podcast pitch competition is going to be something that we've looked at from the tech industry and it's been done elsewhere, but it's ability for people to get up and essentially give their elevator pitch for a podcast, and for that to potentially lead to something a little bit more for them as podcasters.
It all sounds quite amazing. Because as you know, my podcast experience is from my basement office where I'm sitting right now for the past 4 years. And so the idea of having the opportunity to connect with other people who also love podcasting in real life, in person, right here in Calgary, just sounds absolutely amazing. And it's interesting, as you were talking about having people sort of demonstrating or doing podcasting and having people have that opportunity to watch them putting their podcasting skills into practice. It makes me think a lot about being a teacher, because as a teacher, you're sort of in your classroom doing your thing, teaching your class, but you don't really know what's happening in the other classrooms. And one of my favorite jobs that I've had is as a field instructor. So for 4 years, I worked at University of Calgary and I supervised student teachers doing their practicums. So they're all in different schools, and I got to go and sit in all these different classrooms in different schools around Calgary and watch teaching and learning happening. And it was amazing because you learn so much. I mean, I've learned a lot over the years, but a lot of it is through my own sort of trials and tribulations and, asking, hey, I've noticed you're doing that. Like, tell me more about it. Or, what platform are you using? Sort of asking those questions. But to be in a space with people who are passionate, who have ideas, and like to see it actually happening, I know I'm going to learn so much. I'm so excited and ready to soak it all in, all of it.
I love it. Yeah, you've been one of our biggest supporters of it all since we launched, and so it's very much appreciated. It's so cool to see the excitement of people, because it kind of gives us that energy and even that confidence that we're going in the right direction. We've always been open and honest about the idea that this first one especially, we're kind of learning too. We're learning alongside of you guys, and so the benefit we do have, my wife, who's part of the company as well, she's an event planner by background, and so she has the execution capabilities, but the whole thing kind of coming together, it's a learning experience for us too. And so when it's PodSummit YYC 25 or 26, and when we hopefully start moving across the country and all that, each one is going to look back at the previous one, like in education and like in learning. We don't consider, and I don't love the word failure. I kind of always replace it with the word learning, is that you have success and you have learnings. Failure means that you didn't accomplish something, or it's kind of just there and gone. But the way I kind of look at this whole experience is, and even for the build, like this networking at this scale is all brand new to me. And so I'm learning on the fly here about interaction and the importance of, responding quick, and the whole entrepreneurial side of it is brand new to me too. And so this whole experience is learning for all of us. And I want to bring that element into PodSummit as well, is that, no one here is expected to be a professional. No one here is expected to be perfect at any given time. But the expectation is that you're constantly learning, adjusting, tweaking, and ultimately evolving your craft, who you are as a person. It's a spectrum. It's not I've decided this is what I am. You kind of grow and evolve it. Like, I decided when I was 8 years old that I wanted to be a fossil geologist. I had no idea I was going to end up in Calgary for the rest of my life. Like, that's part of the evolution of it all.
Yeah. And your lifelong learner mentality, that like openness to learning, that curiosity, like that, all of that mindset really, I think, is going to just take this and enable you to have huge success. Because I think if we're, you're kind of going into it excited about what you're going to learn by
Hmm.
going through the experience and being open to it,
Yeah.
which is amazing. Now, the three pillars of PodSummit are connection, collaboration, and creation. Again, read those and just like they speak to my heart. So what do those three pillars mean
Yeah.
to you?
Well, it's funny. It was never intentional for them all to start with C, but it kind of it kind of all just came together. And so the connection piece is of course the community piece of it all. It is bringing people together, is connecting people inside of an environment where they can have those discussions. And the collaboration piece is that next extension of the connection. Is once you've made that connection, it is then working together to create something important. And that could be anything from a podcast to a business deal to simply learning. I think collaboration is so important that we're not, because we have a tendency, I think, to do things in isolation. And because we're afraid to quote unquote fail and we're not willing to kind of open up. And, I think even today, because everything's so polarized in the world, that everyone wants to be just right. And I think like the connection and the collaboration piece, it's so important to get that right, because once you get that right, you open up this idea of that, okay, I can do better and I can contribute more and value and I can grow as a person if I just open up a little bit to the idea of collaborating with someone that has a different idea, that maybe sits on a different side of the political spectrum, that maybe just doesn't agree with me in what platform to use for podcasting. I think that collaboration piece is so important because it allows you to kind of break down those barriers. And the creation piece is something that we're all doing. As you know, I've said that the people that we're targeting for PodSummit are simply storytellers. They're people with a story to tell. And you don't have to be a podcaster specifically to do that. You could be a marketer, you could be a coach, you could be a teacher, you could be anything, because we all have these stories that we're trying to tell. And sometimes storytellers fits into someone that's writing a book, but no, like we tell stories every time we have a discussion. We relate to experiences, we relate to things that we have done that are successful or things that we've learned from. And so we all have these stories to tell. And that's what PodSummit is really all about, is like embracing that creation piece of it. Because at the end of the day, as podcasters, whether you're on the business side or whether you're on the creation side, the independent side, whatever, we're all eventually moving towards that creation side of things. And so it's that exploration inside of that environment, inside of that creative spirit that we're also chasing. So that each pillar kind of leads from one to the other, the connection, the collaboration, into the eventual creation. And that is the product that we are delivering to a listener base that is adding value to people beyond the podcast or beyond the industry. And so it's the day-to-day people that are picking up even just like one little thing. I've always thought from a podcasting perspective, like if you can listen to my podcast, and we're kind of an escapism podcast where it's like, turn your brain off while you're doing the dishes, while you're driving the car to go do the parent Uber thing or cutting the grass, whatever. This is your time just to shut off, put us in your ears and escape. And if I can provide a person with 2 minutes of escapism in a busy, crazy, very demanding world, I've been successful. And you here, like if you can provide someone with like one tidbit of advice that they could implement in their life and their life gets like 1 degree better, I think that's so amazing. Like we're having, and it's hard to measure that as podcasters, because I think that we're having an effect on individuals, because, and maybe an effect we'll never ever see, but it's there and it exists, and it's hard to calibrate that as someone, like I'm similar as you. I've been sitting in my basement for 10 years podcasting, no crowd, no reaction. And once you start getting, a few people reacting and you get people sending you a note being like, this is like awesome that you're doing this. I appreciate it. It's been super helpful for me to hear your voice every single week as a consistent piece. And so that creation side of it, that explodes out into this huge value chain going out to listeners and people, and impact that you're never going to be able to measure, but it's there. And so that's kind of like the flow of the pillars of PodSummit.
Yeah, you never really know the impact. I love
Never.
that, but I know that that energy at PodSummit is going to be so there,
Yeah.
connecting all the people who are excited about this space. It's going to be a great energy. And okay, so now we've talked about like how many different hats that you're all wearing. And I'm just thinking to myself, okay, and I love that your wife is on board. And I love that she has expertise and experience that lends itself so
Yes.
beautifully to PodSummit. So What is it looking like for you right now, juggling geologist hat, dad, husband, entrepreneur? Like, what is that looking like for you? How are you doing?
It's busy, but
Yeah.
I honestly, and I have to relate a lot of things back to my experience in the pandemic. That was a time I really struggled. I struggled with this idea of losing control. I struggled with this idea of raising children, young children during all of that, and that piece of my life was busy, but it wasn't really like I didn't feel like I was kind of accomplishing a whole bunch. I was like in protection mode with all of this, and so coming out of the pandemic, I did about like a 2 year self reflections, personal journey thing. That's kind of how I led to PodSummit and all these different things. And so on that journey, I found that I need to be busy and adding just like spurious value all over the place. And I found that when I have a whole bunch of time, that I have a tendency to procrastinate. I have a tendency to kind of get inside my own head and kind of wallow and get almost kind of that analysis paralysis where I'm just always thinking about things but never acting on things. And like I've always been like a fidgety, very busy person. And the pandemic itself, it kind of like really clamped that down. And so coming out of that, I found, okay, I just need to be busy. I need to be always shifting, evolving, and doing different things. And like I've always been like tweaking the podcast and slightly tweaking my parenting style and slightly tweaking how I go about my day-to-day job and everything. And so the juggle, it's not always easy, but I find myself, if I can, I have this like one little thing I use, it's just time blocking. I say like, this is PodSummit time, this is parent time, this is husband time, this is work time, and all this stuff. And I find if I can do that and try not to like, there's obviously overlap and crossover to everything, but I find that if I'm able to kind of compartmentalize those things, that you don't have this bleed. Because the one thing I'm super conscious of is bleeding into specifically like my time with my wife and time with the kids. Like I don't want to be on my phone in front of my kids. I don't want to drop them in front of a TV just so I can get other things done. And so what that means sometimes with PodSummit is that like I log back in at 9 p.m. and I work till midnight on things. And that's just a sacrifice that I'm willing to make. And I balance that out by going to the gym and trying to eat healthy and these type of things so that my body is able to kind of keep up with the pace of life. And, you know, the kids always throw wrenches into everything. And that's kind of some of the excitement of it all. But the other piece of doing this and juggling this many things is having a partner in my wife that she's also extremely busy and juggling 1,000 different things, but that we understand each other and we understand the moments when we need to disconnect. So when I go on podcasts on Tuesday nights, that's my time where I can disconnect. And she does the same thing, you know, when she goes to the gym or I go to the gym, so that we're providing, you know, each other the space and the understanding, you know, when I had to, you know, do all the basically dinner to bedtime with the kids because she's got something going on and vice versa for me. And so this whole tag team that we've developed inside of our lives has been super important as well. Like, I don't think I could do all the stuff that I'm doing right now in the absence of having a partner that is willing to make some sacrifices and kind of pick up slack where I'm dropping it sometimes and vice versa. And that, so we have a very kind of collaborative approach to our lives because we have this base understanding that we both need this stuff to feel good. But we also recognize that, you know, every so often we'll just look at each other and she'll say to me like, it's just chill out night. Like we're not talking PodSummit, we're not talking work. Once the kids are down, we're just gonna park behind us here and put on Netflix or each read or something like that. So there's moments where it's like, okay, we got to click off too, because we need those moments of downtime. It can't all just be go go go, because we're gonna end up burning ourselves out and all that. But so essentially, it's a lot, but I think we have some mechanisms in place that allow us to continue to be successful, but also not drop the ball on specifically the parenting. That's something we're super conscious of, is that like it's so important that the kids see us and not us through a phone. It's a hard sometimes, but sometimes you just got to drop it and just, you know, lay down and play Barbies.
That is great advice. Sometimes you just got to play Barbie.
Yeah.
Oh, well, it sounds like you are very thoughtful and intentional with how you're using your time, and you've got some great strategies and tools helping you manage all of the juggling that you're doing. So, when you think about your podcast journey, So my passion's education and teaching
Mhm.
and learning. So I just would be so curious to hear, how has teaching and learning been a part of your podcast journey? You've sort of alluded to some things, but
Mm.
how has it been a part of it?
Well, it's interesting because like the learning aspect of it is maybe a little easier than the teaching piece of it, because it's like I said, it's always about that, like that 1 degree change in everything that you're doing, and specifically related to podcasting, it's not being okay with the status quo, not being okay with just doing the same thing day in day out. And I always kind of tell podcasters when I'm talking to people that are starting new and people that are asking for advice is that you kind of have to find your voice, but you have to be okay with making those mistakes and then just evolving from there. Like you go back to my very first episode, it's very, very different than my current episodes. And even inside of our current slate, out of our weekly drops, the last 3 weeks have been completely different episodes. And so we like to go in and kind of tweak things, play with ideas, because I think it's so important that this idea of like continuous learning is being applied to the craft of podcasting. And trying new microphones, like I said to you before, I've tried every single different platform. I always do monthly subscriptions to these things because I like canceling them and jumping over when something changes. Like Riverside right now is what we swap to because it can facilitate doing clips and Instagram reels really easy, where we previously used StreamYard because it facilitated streaming onto YouTube really easily when we're doing a lot of that during the pandemic. It's a very, very low barrier platform where you can go on and brand it, boom, and you're right to YouTube. And so there's this idea that, like I said, with the status quo is, don't just go and do the same episode every single week. Ask different questions, feel things out. Like last week, I did an episode where I was by myself, but I just typed into AI questions. So I did an AMA generated by AI, and just trying something different, integrating the different elements of podcasting. And what that also takes on the learning side is two things: listening to yourself. So I would always recommend listening to your own podcast. Whether you edit it or not is another thing, but go back and listen to it. I know a lot of people don't love hearing their own voice and you're picking up mistakes, but that is how you learn and how you get better as a podcaster, by listening to your own voice. I was able to not completely, but I was able to erase a lot of my issues with speaking, like ums and ahs and this. And I fill with and but, not an ah. So like when I hear our prime minister talk and there's full of ums and ahs, I'm like, dude, like I got behind a mic as like a hobbyist and was able to remove that by listening to myself. Like you should be able to do that as well. And so but like the ums are also important because they make the conversations real. So you can't take all of that out. That's part of the conversational piece of it. And the second part is you got to listen to other podcasters. You have to go and invest a bit of time into listening to interview podcasts, talking head podcasts that maybe you don't agree with the people or you don't love the host, but maybe there's something you can learn from it. Go to YouTube and check out podcasters from a video perspective. Like that learning cycle is constant. And that's a bit where PodSummit kind of bolts onto the side of that learning experience as well, is that you're able to go and learn from people that you probably would never connect with otherwise. And you can take these little bits and pieces and improve your podcast from what it was 2 years ago to something completely different. And inside of that, and it's all a process, but you have to be engaging and putting the effort into the learning aspect of it. And I think as podcasters and as someone that spent a lot of time behind the microphone from a teaching side of things, I'm always willing to give advice. Like I've got a friend, she just started a podcast about 6 months ago, and I've been helping her edit and kind of get through the initial hurdles of it all and find her path inside of it. I've got other friends that come to me and say, I'm looking to start a podcast. And I always kind of lay out, here's the time commitment. Here is the piece that you need to understand. You need to get into your why. Like, why are you doing this? If it's for money, you got to step back and rethink what you're doing here. You got to think about, is it about community? Is it about something personal? Is it a business aspect of things? And so there's all of that. So the teaching side of it comes, I think, less natural, but it's, I think, something that's happening all the time. And I just maybe don't notice it as much. And even coming onto podcasts like this and talking about podcasting and talking about the teaching and learning aspect of it is super important. Well, so I think you have to be approaching podcasting with an open mind. That's something that we talked about earlier, is that you're not going to design and develop the best podcast ever produced from your first one. Like my first one sucks, like absolutely sucks. And my new ones, like they're much better, but I'm always tweaking and learning inside of that. So it's a process for sure. And I think learning and teaching is so fundamental to it, and maybe not talked about enough inside of the podcasting space.
Well, you definitely have this incredible sense of curiosity and the sense of wonder and the sense of always wanting to learn and do better, and also support and help and teach others who are wanting to get involved in this space as well. Do you have a favorite teacher that really stands out for you?
Like inside of life in general, I always struggled with this one because like growing up, some people have like a hero or have a person that they look at and say that is the life that I want. I've never really had that person, like this like idea of like replicating or becoming like a shadow of someone that exists out there. As I've always kind of forged my own path, but I would say like from an influence perspective, my parents have been at like a heavy influence on my life from every and like very subtle things like saying, you know, you're going to university at a young age. Like I didn't like they didn't go. I was the first one to go in my family, and they just kind of said, Tim, like this is part of your path. And I never questioned that. I never like rebelled against the idea that I was going to university. It was just always part of the plan. And both my parents are entrepreneurs, and I never had like an entrepreneurial spirit inside of me because both my parents said like maybe think about having benefits, maybe think about having security and job and these type of things before you get into all this. Like they wouldn't trade what they do, I don't think, for anything, but it provided me this like really unique foundation about finding a strong place to pivot from in life. And so I'd say like my parents have always kind of been the foundational piece of who I am. And then also my wife has been a big supporter of everything, and she kind of re-solidified a foundation around me after I moved out to Calgary. Like I moved out here all by myself. I didn't know anyone, and eventually through friends and all this kind of stuff, you know, we got connected and everything. And so she's been a big piece of my life. And then if I had to go like to like some like spurious like person like celebrity or something like that, this is going to be a kind of a weird one, but I've always kind of like, and this is the only person I've ever like really idolized, is his name's Kevin Feige. He's the president and head of Marvel Studios. He was given the keys to that kingdom at 33, and he's produced something that is like actually unbelievable. And he's like the only person I've ever said like I want a book on his life. I just want to like understand his thought process and all that. And you know, like that's probably the only person, and it's just because of my connection to like the pop culture world and kind of extrapolating that into the business world and what he's been able to do, his approach. Like I insert a lot of his teachings into how we're marketing PodSummit as well. This idea of like always making sure people are talking about it. And so like there's that little piece, but I would say I've never like really idolized someone, but my parents and my wife have been kind of the big supporters, I would say, in life of me going on this like kind of wild journey across Canada and Europe and all this kind of stuff, where my whole career and all of this stuff has kind of come together here in Calgary.
So, in this wild journey of yours, what is something you're the most proud of?
I'd say my kids for sure. Like as a parent, I know it sounds cliche to go to that, but like, being a parent was something that was always on my radar. It was always an inevitability for me, but I never could fully appreciate the impact that that ultimately had and is having on my life. Especially, I have two girls, and so my perspective on the world completely changed having them. For everything from this idea of inclusivity and diversity, because I like as a male growing up, I never had a problem seeing myself reflected on TV or in movies or in the world. And I didn't appreciate it till I had girls like as much. Like I've always understood this idea, but it really in like especially being in pop culture, like when Disney took over Star Wars and all this stuff, where they started inserting females and pulling together diverse casts, and so that people could see themselves reflected more in those environments and the importance of that. And so I think like my girls have really brought that out in me and helped me understand the need. And this extrapolates again into PodSummit and podcasting, is like the importance of people having people that look like them or sound like them or think like them in a place where they can have those conversations too. And so I'd say parenting, I'm immensely proud father, and I love doing it. And it's just, it's a lot of fun. And I'd say like even my career, I'm super proud of what I've been able to accomplish inside of that. I come from a very small town. I went to university. I kind of forged my own path, and it was able to become quite successful in the space of geology, which, it's a passion that has led to a career, which is kind of something that's not, I wouldn't say entirely unique, but it's definitely, like, I don't know if people grow up to say like, I would like, and this isn't a knock at accountants or anything like that, but I don't know if that's like something you write down in a journal when you're 8 years old. And so I had this like really cool, proud path of following a dream I had for my entire life that was able and has able to allow me to facilitate, a really great life for my family and all that. And so I'm really proud of who I am as a geologist and things I've accomplished inside of that industry too.
Well, you've done many amazing things, and I love hearing your thoughts and perspectives on that. I'm curious, when it comes to podcasting, I need to ask you this before we sort of start to wrap things up, but what are you listening to?
Oh man, so that's I could go kind of anywhere with it. So I have like a really diverse. I'm gonna pull it up here right now. So number one on my list, I gotta shout out my dude Jeff Humphreys, Calgary Sessions, always
He's
number one,
amazing. Yeah.
always number one on my list for podcasts. When that drops, it's been so great actually to watch him evolve too, and how much I've learned about the city of Calgary just from listening to all the diverse and varied histories of people that have come here and started something really cool, and from those people have influenced so many others and impacted so many in the city. I listen to my favorite podcast of all time. Actually, it's a funny one. It's called the Major Wrestling Figure Podcast. It's two ex WWE wrestlers that talk about action figures, and they have, from my perspective, both from a love of kind of just the collecting side of things, but they also have the most fascinating and I think undervalued approach to podcasting, in the sense that they've been able to create a podcast that is their focal point, their community builder. But from that, they've been able to do so many cool things from a business perspective. The podcast itself makes them a bit of money, but it's everything that's spun out of the podcast that has actually allowed them to create a kind of an empire inside of it. It's such a cool story. I listen to things like The Game by Alex Hormozy. So he's an entrepreneur. So I've gotten into a lot of like entrepreneurship podcasts and all that. And so he's a bit of a wild man, but I just love his blunt approach to entrepreneurship. And he's got some cool books out and all that. And I've got a couple others. I showed up my friend Mark Condrat. So he owns Alberta Beer Fest. He's got a couple podcasts, Let's Meet for a Beer and Explore 84. Those are on the list as well, because I find myself consuming more local podcasts too, local creators. And of course, this podcast right here that we're on. It's awesome to see like just so many creators, but that's probably the ones that I go to every single week, where I definitely try to get my fill of business and kind of the wrestling, the fun side of things, and then some of the self growth and self help and kind of expanding out there. So those are the big ones, and so I find myself averaging like 5 to 7 podcasts a week is probably what I consume.
That's a decent number, and a good diversity in
Yes.
terms of what you're listening to. So as we're sort of wrapping up our conversation, I always like to bring it back to the education piece, because, as we've talked about, even in podcasting, teaching and learning is such a big part of it. And it really is such a big part of everything that we do, how we work and live and play and explore and build relationships. So I'm just wondering if you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom to share with people listening that might inspire them or support them in their own teaching and learning journeys.
I think it goes back to the word that we've talked about a few times here, and that's just be curious. I think that is the most important thing, and being curious with an open mind. I know this world can be extremely polarizing. If you're not with me, you're against me sort of mentality at times. And social media is a bit of a mess for that. But I found going into things with an open mind, and you're always going to have your biases. You're always going to have your leanings, and you're always going to have your kind of those foundational things that are immovable for you. But I think at the same time, the ability to kind of open up and listen is so important. And so embracing curiosity with an open mind and the willingness to listen, I think is only going to improve things. I really wish more of that happened in the world today. Even from a parent perspective, is that, we always try to teach our girls, like, just step back for a second. When they come home and say, this girl did this, or this person frustrated me, it's like, just step back for a second. Maybe she had a really bad night, or maybe she just isn't feeling well today. And don't judge a person based off of that one simple interaction. And so that's the kind of the education piece of it, is like, I think that there's like a fundamental piece of curiosity, but to be a curious person, you also have to be an open person. And so that's the kind of where maybe where I'll leave that, so that we don't end off on another big, huge tangent here. But that's I think fundamental. And I think it's a very important piece of parenting for us too.
It really is. There's often more to the story.
There's always, like, as podcasters,
Yeah.
there's literally always more to the story. And that goes into, I think, everyday life. Like, everyone on the street, everyone has their own stuff, their own issues, and maybe just catch someone on a bad day, because there's always more to the story. And that's the best part about podcasting, and that's why I've been doing it for so long. That's why you've been doing it for so long, because there's always more story to tell.
There really, really is. Tim, I want to thank you so very much for sharing your time and your stories and all your wisdom today. If people are listening and they want to find out more about you and more about PodSummit and all the things that are happening with that, where are the best places to connect and find out more?
Well, I really appreciate you having me here. This has been a phenomenal experience. I just love talking about this stuff, and I get all giddy and excited, and I'm going to walk away from this just absolutely vibrating and have just energy to tackle Friday now. So I appreciate you having me on this podcast. And if you're interested in PodSummit, every social channel, it's at PodSummit, or you can go to podsummit.com or .ca. You can find everything about what we're doing out here in Calgary and what we're trying to build. You can find our email there too, if you're interested in, I'm always open to just connecting with people, chatting, just having a conversation is super important to me. And that's part of the pillars of PodSummit. And if you're looking for the podcasting, if you're a bit more on the nerd side of the world, everything is at the Nerd RM. So short form for room. So the Nerd RM on Instagram is kind of where primarily hang out. So that's a good one. And they can find our podcast anywhere at the Nerd Room Podcast. So again, I appreciate you having me here. This has been an absolute blast.
I appreciate you joining me so much. It was so much fun to connect with you today, Tim.